The grand palace of Archael was alive with the hum of music, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter of guests. It was the day of Princess Alara's royal wedding, and the air was thick with excitement. The royal gardens were in full bloom, and the gold and silver decorations glittered under the bright light of the twin moons. Alara was about to marry a powerful warlord, a man known across the stars for his strength and his many victories. It was a marriage of duty, a way to ensure peace for her kingdom. Yet, there was an undeniable sadness in her heart. She had never met the man she was to marry. She had only heard the stories, the rumors that floated through the palace halls. He was strong, fierce, and ruthless in battle. But the princess wondered what lay beneath the surface. Could such a man be the one to rule beside her? As she stood near the grand altar, dressed in her finest gown of silver and lavender, Alara's thoughts wandered. The guests, seated in rows, were all eagerly waiting for the ceremony to begin. But one figure caught her eye, standing alone near the back of the gathering. It was a man, but not just any man. His appearance was plain compared to the others, a quiet stranger among the crowd of warriors and nobles. He was human, Alara realized. The human race was rare on her planet, and she had heard little about them beyond vague stories. His face was serene, almost detached from the revelry around him. His clothes were simple, a dark tunic with no signs of wealth or title. He seemed completely out of place among the high-born guests and the glittering uniforms of the soldiers. For some reason, Alara felt drawn to him. There was something in his stillness that spoke to her. While the rest of the guests chattered and exchanged pleasantries, this man remained silent, almost like a shadow. She watched him for a long moment, her curiosity growing. Just then, the doors of the palace hall swung open, and the grand procession began. The sound of music swelled, and the guests rose to their feet. But Alara's gaze did not shift. She continued to watch the quiet human, even as her betrothed, Lord Kalen, made his entrance. Lord Kalen was everything Alara had been told to expect. He was tall, muscular, and wore a dark armor adorned with gleaming gold. His black hair was neatly tied back, and his piercing blue eyes scanned the room with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. The crowd cheered for him, and Alara's heart sank. She had known from the start that this union was not one of love, but of necessity. Peace required sacrifices, and this marriage was one of them. As Kalen approached her, Alara forced a smile. She took his hand, and the ceremony began. But in the back of her mind, she could not shake the image of the silent man. Who was he? What was he doing here? And why did he seem so unaffected by the grand occasion? The ceremony moved on. The vows were exchanged, the blessings given, and the crowd cheered. Alara's mind was not fully present. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the quiet stranger. After the ceremony, there was a grand feast held in the palace courtyard. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter and conversation. The guests ate, drank, and celebrated the union of the princess and her future husband. But once again, Alara found herself searching for the same figure among the crowd. She finally spotted him standing alone at the edge of the courtyard, still as a statue. Without thinking, Alara excused herself from the festivities and made her way toward him. She walked slowly, unsure of what she would say or why she was even drawn to him. But something about his presence was magnetic, pulling her closer despite herself. As she approached, the man turned his head, and their eyes met. He gave her a slight nod, acknowledging her presence. "Excuse me," Alara said softly, her voice almost lost in the hum of the crowd. "I couldn't help but notice you earlier. You're not from around here, are you?" The man smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile, but his eyes were kind. "No," he replied in a low, calm voice. "I'm not. I'm a traveler, passing through." "You seem so out of place," Alara said, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Aren't you supposed to be celebrating with the rest of the guests?" "I don't celebrate much," the man replied, his voice steady and calm. I find it better to watch. Elara was taken aback by his response. He didn't seem bothered by the grand event. In fact, he seemed completely unfazed by it all. It was strange, yet somehow refreshing. In a world filled with pomp and circumstance, this man stood out because of his simplicity. I'm Princess Elara, she said, introducing herself, though she knew it was unnecessary. May I ask your name? The man hesitated for a moment before replying. Ethan. Ethan, Elara repeated, tasting the name on her lips. It felt strangely familiar, though she couldn't quite place why. What brings you to our celebration, Ethan? I was invited, he said, his tone mild. Though I didn't come for the ceremony. Then why are you here? Elara asked, genuinely curious. Ethan met her gaze, and for a moment, his expression softened. I came to see the princess, he said simply. Elara's brow furrowed in confusion. Me? Yes, he replied. There's something about you. Your story has traveled far. And I wanted to see for myself what kind of person you are. Elara was surprised. She had heard many stories about herself, but never had someone spoken of her so frankly. Most people either revered her or feared her. They never spoke to her like this. I don't understand, she said. Why would you want to see me? I'm just a woman marrying a man of power. There's nothing special about that. Ethan gave her a small, almost sad smile. Perhaps that's exactly what makes you interesting, he said. The world sees you as a princess, a symbol of peace, of power. But I think there's more to you than that. Elara felt a strange sensation in her chest. She had always lived her life according to expectations. As a princess, her duty was clear: to marry, to secure peace, to rule with wisdom and grace. But this man, this quiet stranger, seemed to see something in her that no one else did. Something hidden, something real. Why do you think there's more to me? Elara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a kind of knowing. Because, he said softly, I've seen how people like you are often trapped in their own stories. They forget who they really are beneath the title. Properly need. The title. Elara didn't know how to respond. She had never met anyone like Ethan before. He was not in awe of her because of her title. Nor did he look at her with the usual admiration or fear. Instead, he looked at her like someone who had known her in a different life. Someone who understood that there was more to her than the weight of her crown. For the first time that day, Elara felt seen. Truly seen. Not as a princess, not as a bride, but as herself. And that feeling, though foreign, was one she couldn't ignore. Thank you, Ethan, she said, her voice filled with a quiet sincerity. You've given me something to think about. Ethan nodded, and with that, he turned and quietly disappeared into the crowd, leaving Elara standing there, her heart full of questions and a newfound curiosity about the quiet man who had seen her when no one else had. The days following the royal wedding were filled with celebrations, but Princess Elara's mind often wandered back to the quiet stranger she had met at the palace. Ethan was still a mystery to her. He had been at the wedding, standing so far apart from the others, yet his calm presence had left an impression on her that she couldn't shake. Even now, weeks after their brief conversation, she found herself thinking about him more often than she cared to admit. Elara spent her days with Lord Kalan, her newly married husband, preparing for their future rule and managing the affairs of the kingdom. Kalan was everything a warrior king should be. Strong, commanding, and focused on the kingdom's safety. He was not a cruel man, but he was distant and often lost in his thoughts. He expected Elara to be at his side, and she had learned early on to play the part of the perfect queen. Her role was to support him, smile for the people, and provide counsel when necessary. But despite the grand responsibilities she held, Elara felt trapped in a world that was not of her making. Her marriage, though politically necessary, had not brought her the peace she had hoped for. Lord Callan was a man of few words, and their conversations were often brief and formal. The affection that others expected from a marriage was absent. Alara had resigned herself to the reality that love was something she would never experience with him. Still, she carried out her duties as best as she could. Her people saw her as a queen, a symbol of stability. But she often wondered who she truly was behind the title. And then there was Ethan. He had been at the wedding, but he hadn't been part of the crowd that celebrated her union. He hadn't shown any interest in the festivities, nor had he joined the others in the grand feast. Instead, he had quietly stood in the background, watching everything unfold with a calmness that made him seem out of place. His words were few, but they had stuck with Alara. There was something about him that drew her in, something she couldn't fully explain. Over the weeks, Alara found herself searching for reasons to leave the palace, to escape the stiff walls of her royal life. One evening, after a particularly tiresome meeting with Callan about the kingdom's defenses, Alara decided to go for a walk in the palace gardens. She often found solace there, surrounded by the scent of blooming flowers and the soft sound of birds in the trees. It was a place where she could think clearly, away from the eyes of the court. As she walked along the winding paths, Alara's mind once again drifted to Ethan. She had not seen him since that night at the wedding. Where had he gone? What had he meant by his words? She could not stop herself from wondering. It wasn't like her to dwell on a stranger, especially when she had so many pressing matters to attend to. But there was something about him, something that tugged at her heart. The evening air was cool as she wandered deeper into the gardens. The palace grounds were vast, and there were many secluded areas where she could walk without being seen. It was during one of these quiet moments, lost in her thoughts, that Alara heard a soft rustling in the bushes. She paused, her senses alert. It was probably just a servant or a guard, but something about the sound made her curious. Stepping cautiously toward the noise, she was surprised to find none other than Ethan himself, sitting on a bench in the dim light of the garden. He didn't notice her approach at first, and Alara took a moment to study him from behind a tree. He looked the same as he had at the wedding. Quiet, reserved. Yet there was something about his presence that made him stand out even in the shadows. Ethan had his head slightly tilted upward, as though he were contemplating something deep. His eyes were closed, and his posture was relaxed. It was hard to imagine that such a man could be capable of anything other than peace, but Alara knew there was more to him than met the eye. She hesitated for a moment before stepping forward, making her presence known. "Ethan?" she called softly. Ethan opened his eyes and turned to look at her, his face expressionless. For a moment, there was silence between them, and Alara felt the weight of his gaze. Then, without a word, he stood and nodded in acknowledgement. "Your Highness," he said, his voice calm as ever. "I did not expect to see you here." "I could say the same for you," Alara replied, her voice light but curious. "What brings you to the gardens?" Ethan looked around, as if searching for the right words. "I enjoy the quiet," he said simply. "There's a peace here that I don't find elsewhere." Alara nodded, understanding more than he realized. "I came for the same reason," she admitted. "The palace. It can be overwhelming at times." Ethan gave her a small, understanding smile. "I imagine it would be. You have many responsibilities." "Yes," Alara said, taking a step closer. "But it's not just the responsibilities. It's the weight of everything. The expectations, the titles. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll ever be able to escape them." Ethan studied her for a moment before sitting back down on the bench. He patted the space beside him, inviting her to join him. Alara hesitated for only a moment before sitting beside him. There was something about his calm presence that made her feel at ease, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't think you can ever truly escape your responsibilities," Ethan said, his voice thoughtful. "I don't want to just accept them," Alara said softly, looking down at her hands. "I want to understand them. I want to understand me. Who I am, not just as a princess, but as a person. But sometimes it feels like the more I try, the further away I get." Ethan remained quiet for a moment, letting her words sink in. When he spoke again, his tone was gentle. You are more than just a title, Alara. You've been given a role. Yes, but that doesn't define who you are. You can still be yourself, even in the face of all that is expected of you. Alara turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this before. Most people saw her as a symbol, as a figurehead, but Ethan saw something deeper. He saw her for who she was beneath the crown and the royal gown. I wish I could believe that, Alara said quietly. Ethan smiled, a small, knowing smile. It takes time, he said, but you'll get there. You just need to trust yourself. Alara looked at him, her heart beating a little faster. She didn't know why, but she felt a deep connection to Ethan. He was different from anyone she had ever met. He didn't want anything from her, and he didn't look at her with awe or reverence. He saw her as an equal, a person, not just a princess. For the first time in a long while, Alara felt as though someone truly understood her. It was a strange, almost comforting feeling. And yet, it also left her with more questions. Who was Ethan? Really, what did he mean when he said he had seen her? There was so much more to him than his quiet demeanor let on. As the conversation drifted into silence, Alara felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could begin to find them. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan would help her along the way. Weeks passed after that evening in the gardens, and Alara found herself thinking about Ethan more than she should have. Despite her royal duties, despite the countless matters she needed to address as queen, her mind kept returning to their conversations. Ethan had spoken to her like no one ever had, not as a princess, but as a person. And that, perhaps more than anything, had drawn her in. She didn't understand it, but she couldn't deny the connection she felt. It wasn't that she had fallen in love with him, that wasn't possible. She was already married to Lord Kalen, the man she was meant to rule beside. Yet there was something about Ethan's quiet presence, his gentle wisdom, that felt like a breath of fresh air. In a life filled with expectations and obligations, the kingdom, meanwhile, had grown more peaceful. The threat of war that had loomed over them for so long had lessened with the marriage between Alara and Kalen. Lord Kalen had been busy overseeing the military strategies, focusing on the defense of the kingdom, while Alara had managed the affairs of the court. Despite the calm, there was an unspoken tension in the air. It was the kind of tension that comes with knowing that peace was never permanent, that there would always be threats, both seen and unseen, lurking in the shadows. One afternoon, while Alara was walking through the palace courtyard, a messenger arrived with urgent news. Alara's heart sank as the messenger handed her a scroll. It was from Lord Kalen. The letter was short, but to the point. There had been reports of a large force moving toward their borders. A rival empire, the Zethar Dominion, was marching its armies to their kingdom. The letter warned that a full invasion could be imminent. Alara felt a cold wave of panic rise within her. She had been expecting this for some time. The political landscape of the galaxy was fragile, and the peace her marriage had secured was always temporary. But hearing it so plainly, in a letter, made it all too real. Kalen's letter ended with a request for her presence in the war room immediately. She knew what that meant. Her husband needed her to help make decisions, to offer counsel. She also knew that the people in the palace would be watching, waiting for her to take charge. As Alara made her way to the war room, her mind raced. She had never been involved in the kingdom's military planning before, and she wasn't sure how much she could contribute. She was a queen, yes, but she was not a soldier. Her strength was in diplomacy, in managing the court, in keeping peace. But now, war was knocking at their door, and she had to prepare herself to face it. When she entered the war room, Kalen was already there, along with a group of military advisors and generals. The room fell silent as she entered, and Kalen gave her a brief nod, acknowledging her presence. His face was grim, his eyes clouded with the weight of the situation. "Alara," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "The Zethar Dominion has mobilized its forces. We need to prepare for a potential attack. I need your help in managing the kingdom's response. Alara nodded, trying to steady herself. Of course, she said. What do you need me to do? Kalen looked at her, his eyes searching hers. We need to send messengers to our allies, to call in reinforcements. We need to fortify our defenses. Prepare the people for what's coming. Alara's thoughts spun. She was used to managing the palace, managing the court's affairs. But this was different. This was war. She didn't have the experience, the knowledge to command troops or strategize military tactics. But she couldn't let her fear show. She was the queen. She had to act like it. Where do we start? She asked, trying to focus. We'll need to establish our defensive lines first. One of the generals spoke up. The Zethar forces are large, and they'll likely hit us on multiple fronts. We need to prepare for that. As the meeting continued, Alara listened carefully, her mind racing to process everything. It was clear that Kalen was the one in charge of the strategy, but Alara had an important role to play in uniting the people and ensuring that the kingdom was ready for whatever came. There was a sense of dread hanging in the air, but Alara forced herself to remain calm. She had to. When the meeting finally concluded, Alara stepped out of the war room, her mind overwhelmed by the weight of what lay ahead. The news of the invasion was still fresh in her mind, and the gravity of the situation settled heavily in her chest. The kingdom was on the brink of war, and there was little she could do to stop it. As she wandered the palace halls, her thoughts turned once again to Ethan. For some reason, his quiet presence and calm demeanor had given her a sense of peace that she desperately needed now. She didn't know why, but she felt a deep urge to find him. Perhaps he could offer her some guidance, some perspective on the chaos that was unfolding around her. After a few minutes of searching, Alara found herself in the palace gardens again, the place where she had met Ethan weeks before. She had not expected to find him there, but to her surprise, he was sitting on a bench, staring out at the view. His posture was relaxed, his expression thoughtful. Ethan, Alara said, her voice carrying a mix of relief and uncertainty. I didn't expect to find you here. Ethan turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting hers. Your Highness, he said, his voice calm and steady as always. I felt you might need someone to talk to. Alara sat beside him without a word, her thoughts swirling in her mind. After a moment of silence, she spoke. The kingdom is on the brink of war. Kalen is preparing for battle, but I'm not sure what I can do. I'm not a warrior, not a strategist. Ethan listened quietly, his expression unchanged. You don't need to be a warrior to lead, Alara, he said softly. Your strength lies in something else. You have the ability to bring people together, to inspire them. That's what a leader does. But how can I inspire them when I'm so afraid myself? Alara asked, her voice filled with frustration. I'm supposed to be strong, to show my people that everything will be all right. But I don't feel that way. I feel powerless. Ethan turned to face her fully, his eyes searching hers. Fear is natural, Alara. It's what you do with that fear that matters. Do you let it control you, or do you rise above it? You're already stronger than you think. Alara looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something in his words that calmed her, something in his steady gaze that reminded her of the person she was before all the titles and expectations. Maybe she wasn't a soldier, but she was still a queen, and in this moment, she realized that being a queen wasn't about knowing how to wield a sword or command an army. It was about standing with her people, guiding them through the storm, no matter how dark it seemed. You're right, she said, her voice more certain now. I can't let my fear control me. I have to do my part, no matter how difficult it is. Ethan smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. That's the spirit. You'll find your strength, Alara. I believe in you. As Alara sat beside Ethan, the weight of her responsibilities felt a little lighter. She still didn't know what the future would hold. But for the first time in a long while, she felt ready to face it. The days following their conversation in the garden were filled with tense preparations. Alara's life, which had once been filled with diplomatic talks and quiet afternoons in the palace, had now shifted into something unrecognizable. The kingdom was on the brink of war, and every day felt heavier than the last. Lord Kalen, as expected, had taken charge of the military strategy, but Alara was not without her own responsibilities. She had a crucial role to play in rallying the people, assuring them that their leadership would not falter, even in the face of the coming storm. Her presence, her words, could inspire confidence. The people needed to believe that their queen was unshaken, even if Alara herself was often gripped with doubt. The Zethar Dominion, a powerful and ruthless empire known for its military strength, was on the move. Their forces were large, and they had a reputation for overwhelming their enemies with sheer numbers. The first reports of their approach came in the form of warning ships on the horizon, a growing fleet that would soon encircle the kingdom. Alara knew that the coming battle would decide the fate of her people. The hours were long, and the decisions were heavy. There were meetings with generals, with diplomats, with advisors, and Alara felt as though she was drowning in a sea of information. Each new report only seemed to add to the pressure. But through it all, her thoughts often returned to Ethan. In the quiet moments between the chaos, Alara would find herself searching for him. The last time they had spoken, Ethan's calm demeanor had given her the peace she desperately needed. His words that fear was natural, but how one responded to it was what mattered, kept echoing in her mind. It was strange, but whenever she was near him, she felt as though the weight of the world didn't rest solely on her shoulders. She wasn't alone in her struggle. One evening, just after a particularly exhausting strategy meeting, Alara found herself once again wandering the palace gardens. She needed a moment of quiet, a break from the constant tension that had begun to wear on her. The cool night air filled her lungs as she walked slowly through the garden paths, her mind still racing with thoughts of battle and leadership. And then, as if by fate, she found him. Ethan was sitting on a bench by the fountain, his face calm as always. He wasn't looking at her, but when she approached, he turned his head and smiled softly. "Your Highness," he said, his voice as steady as ever. "Alara," she corrected him gently, though she couldn't deny the comfort that his calm presence brought her. Ethan nodded, acknowledging her informal request. "Alara," he repeated, his tone respectful but warm. "How are you holding up?" Alara sat beside him on the bench, looking out over the garden, though she couldn't focus on the beauty around her. Her mind was too consumed with the coming war. "It's harder than I imagined," she admitted, her voice quiet. "The pressure, the decisions. I'm supposed to be strong for my people, but sometimes I feel so small." Ethan listened, his gaze never leaving her as she spoke. "It's normal to feel that way," he said after a moment. "When you carry the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders, it can be overwhelming. But strength isn't about not feeling afraid. It's about acting despite that fear." Alara turned to him, her eyes searching his face. "And you, Ethan? How do you manage? You've been through so much, I'm sure." Ethan's expression softened, but he didn't immediately respond. He seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "I've learned that no one truly manages it alone," he said. "We all need support. Whether it's from the people around us or from within ourselves, there's always something to hold on to." Alara nodded slowly, her thoughts swirling. She had been relying on Kalen and the military to fight this battle, but she had never thought about her own strength, her own role as a leader. She had always been the one who stood behind others, offering counsel, offering guidance. But now, she had to be the one at the forefront, leading her people through the dark times ahead. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. "You don't have to be," Ethan replied gently. "You'll rise to meet the challenge, just as you always have. The people believe in you. They need you to be their guide." Alara's eyes met his, and for a moment, she felt as though she could truly see him, not just the quiet man who had appeared out of nowhere, but someone who had lived through his own battles, both internal and external. Ethan's calmness, his wisdom, wasn't just something he was born with. He had earned it through experience, through hardship. "I don't know how to repay you for all the support you've given me," she said, her voice sincere. "You've helped me more than I can say." Ethan looked at her with a small smile, though his eyes were filled with something deeper. "You don't need to repay me," he said simply. "We help each other because it's the right thing to do. And I believe in you, Elara. You are more than capable of leading your people through this." The words settled in her heart like a comforting balm. She had always known her duty, but Ethan's belief in her made her believe in herself again. It was a small shift, but one that would change everything. The next few days were a blur. The Zethar Dominion's forces were closing in, and Elara had no choice but to make the final preparations. She had to trust in Kaelin's military strategy, but she also had to stand by her people, to show them that their queen was strong. She took Ethan's words to heart, and as she walked through the kingdom, speaking with the soldiers, the farmers, the artisans, she saw the difference in their faces. They looked to her not just for leadership, but for hope. The night before the battle, Elara found herself once again in the gardens, seeking a moment of quiet. This time, Ethan wasn't there. But she didn't feel lonely. She felt ready. For the first time in days, the fear that had gripped her heart was gone. There was still uncertainty ahead. But she knew that whatever happened, she would face it with the strength she had found within herself. The battle began at dawn. The Zethar forces were vast, their ships covering the skies like dark clouds. But Elara stood by her people, her resolve unwavering. As Kaelin led the charge from the front lines, Elara remained in the capital, coordinating with the generals and keeping the people safe. The battle was fierce, but Elara knew that she had a role to play not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of her people. Hours later, the news came. The kingdom had held its ground. The Zethar forces were retreating, their momentum broken by the strength of the kingdom's defenses and the leadership of its queen. Elara's heart soared with relief and pride. The battle wasn't over, but the first victory had been won. When Kaelin returned to the palace, his face weary but triumphant, he sought Elara out. She stood at the edge of the balcony, looking out over the kingdom she had just saved. "We did it," Kaelin said, his voice filled with both exhaustion and pride. Elara turned to him, her eyes shining with a quiet strength. "No, Kaelin," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We did it together." And as the sun set over the horizon, Elara knew that no matter what the future held, she would face it with the same strength that had seen her through the darkest of times. With her people by her side, and with the quiet legend named Ethan still somewhere in the shadows, Elara felt ready to lead her kingdom into the light of a new day.